My name is Randy Melzi, and I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy Programs and Corporate Relations at the Americas Society and Council of the Americas. Our program this evening is a discussion on Mexico's telecom reform. Our panelists are Francisco Gil, Executive President of Telefónica Mexico, Jonathan Herbst, Managing Director and Senior Member of Global Media Communications Group at UBS, Ruben Kraim, Partner of Covington and Burling LLP, and Gustavo Lopez, Vice President and Regional Counsel of Discovery Latin America, U.S. Hispanic. The telecommunications reform in Mexico has been widely anticipated. If successful, it will do much to enhance Mexico's competitiveness. This program is part of our Mexico series, which is sponsored by MetLife, and the live webcast, as in all of our webcasts, is sponsored by Telefónica. Thank you. And with that, I turn the floor over to Ruben Kraim, who will moderate the program. Thank you for joining us live and via webcast.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to all. Can you all hear properly? It's working fine. Again, thank you all for being here. I am going to try to frame the conversation with a few remarks at the beginning, and then we'll be asking questions of our very distinguished panel that we have tonight or this afternoon, and then ask basically for there to be some discussion among the panelists, as well as take questions from you all. I think in order to put the reform in some perspective and to frame the issues, it may be useful to look at what has happened over the course of the last 7 months. That is the term of the current administration. The new administration that took office December 1st of last year. It has been a remarkable period of very bold, very intensive work aimed at finally putting into place the structural reforms that have very consistently been identified as being needed for the development of Mexico. Of those structural reforms, probably one of the ones that was been most eagerly anticipated and that was thought to be perhaps among the hardest to accomplish is in fact the reform of the telecom sector. Now, the telecom sector in Mexico, telecom and media sectors in Mexico, have long been understood to be, for lack of a better term, somewhat dysfunctional. And I use that term advisedly because that is the term that the OECD used in a report that was widely distributed and widely read, the OECD Review of Telecommunication Policy and Regulation in Mexico, which was issued in 2012. And in order to put the reforms in some perspective, I'm going to quote verbatim from the report. The report, in its diagnosis of the sector, says, the welfare loss attributed to the dysfunctional Mexican telecommunications sector is estimated at $129 billion during the period 2005 to 2009. In other words, foregone gross domestic product, or 1.8% of gross domestic product per annum. So the cost that was associated to the lack of competition, the poor penetration, the difficulties of the sector in terms of delivering service to the users was quantified at that level. Again, the Mexican telecommunications market, says the OECD, and this is just a fact, is dominated by a single company with 80% of the fixed line market and 70% of the mobile phone market. Insufficient competition has resulted in poor market penetration, measured by subscribers per 100 inhabitants, for fixed line, mobile, and broadband markets, ranking Mexico out of the 34 OECD countries, 34th, 33rd, and 32nd, respectively. In other words, for fixed, mobile, and broadband. Relative to other OECD countries, Mexico is ranked last in terms of investment per capita in the telecommunications sector. At the same time, and this is again quoting from the OECD report, profit margins of the incumbent are nearly double the OECD average. The OECD report ends with the following broad diagnosis. The unsatisfactory performance of telecommunications markets in Mexico is due in part to the relentless use of injunctions, in particular by the fixed and mobile incumbent, which cannot be addressed by a dysfunctional system and has replaced to a large extent the right and responsibility of government to implement economic policy and regulation. This was the diagnosis, obviously based on the poor penetration, the high cost, the difficulties that new entrants have encountered in approaching the market, at the same time that everyone has all along recognized there have been very real, very difficult barriers to overcome that obviously it took a great deal of effort, it took a great deal of skill to put together a package of reforms that would even begin to address them. So the reform, as I'm sure you all know, was put in place as a constitutional reform. It therefore needed to be approved or ratified by a majority of the states of Mexico, which of course it was so ratified. And when it was then published, it was published in the Diario Oficial and took effect the day after publication. It is, however, a very high-level reform, precisely because it is a constitutional reform, precisely because it foresees or contemplates a very extensive process of legislation and rulemaking that will follow over the course of a specified time period, beginning, in fact, today. That is, beginning with the installation of the new regulator, the Instituto Federal de Telecomunicaciones, IFETEL, that has been now given enormous new powers and in fact has become not only the regulator of the sector, but also the competition regulator for the sector. Now, what does the reform do? Among many other things, and by the way, it is very notable that much of what it does follows very, very closely the specific recommendations of the OECD report. It's quite remarkable how closely it tracks the OECD recommendations. So, for example, the reform removes, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, the ability of a regulated person to obtain a suspension, an injunction, effectively, against the effectiveness of a determination by the regulator, which has been the reason why the regulator has been, frankly, incapable of impacting real behavior on the ground, because injunctions are so readily obtained and take so long, literally years and years and years, to resolve. The reform explicitly authorizes and directs this new regulator to identify players in the sector that have a dominant position and requires that they be identified within a specified time period, and thereafter it authorizes and directs the regulator to require those dominant players to make their critical infrastructure available to other participants in the market. So, for example, any piece of infrastructure, say towers, that are essential to the provision of the service have to be made available to competitors or new entrants on commercial terms. The reform removes the limitation on foreign ownership of telecommunications assets and services, which had been set at 49%, except for mobile, and now takes it all the way up to 100% in foreign ownership. This will remove a certain distortion that existed in the market as people tried to somehow match the 49% ownership and the requirement of Mexican control with the reality that at times the contribution, the financial contribution or technical contribution of the non-Mexican participant exceeded 49%. All sorts of somewhat artificial vehicles were developed to enable that to happen. This effectively removes that obstacle and in essence says for potential foreign entrants into the market, you do whichever business deal makes sense, and if it means you get to 100%, that is okay as well, including for satellite, by the way. The one piece where there is still a ownership or foreign ownership requirement is in broadcasting media, where the limit is set at 49% subject to reciprocity. Now, this is a very important move in the direction of opening up the sector. What else does the reform do? I'll just go through it very quickly, a couple of very significant items. It calls for the enactment of a single, unified, convergent regulatory framework so that, in effect, the entire scope of the sector will be under a single overriding policy framework. Equally, every license or concession will effectively enable the holder to perform whatever telecommunications service or to offer whatever telecommunications service it wishes without having to specifically negotiate the scope of each such concession. It calls for the auctioning off of licenses for 2 new television networks with broad national coverage that the current duopoly is excluded from bidding for, so that there is an assurance that there will be new entrants. It imposes a must carry and a must offer, which is to say that any pay television provider has to be willing to enable the transmission of independent programming, and at the same time that any producer of programming cannot opt to simply withhold the programming from the pay TV provider. It provides for a digital transition, which, as many of you know, I'm sure, has been a matter of some controversy in Mexico. It sets a deadline for it to be done by December 31st, 2015, and then contemplates an alternative use for the for the frequencies that will be freed up upon the digital transition being complete. And it earmarks 90 megahertz of the 700 megahertz spectrum for use by the state, that is the government, in the form of Telecomunicaciones de Mexico, to construct effectively and provide a shared public telecommunications network that will serve as an alternative to the incumbent, effectively a wholesale provider of services on the back of a backbone that is currently principally in the hands of the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the electrical utility, and will effectively be assigned over in terms of its use to Telecom de Mexico for the purpose of constructing this alternative backbone. The construction of this alternative backbone is itself an extraordinarily ambitious infrastructure project. All by itself, it would have very substantial consequences in the market. But it is meant, obviously, to work together with all these other reforms that are meant, in turn, to open effectively a new day in terms of competition, in terms of ease of entry, efficiency of regulation, and the efficacy of regulation. Now, I've spoken entirely on the positive side. I've tried to present or put forward what I think is the most sort of affirmative case for the reform. What I would like to invite our panelists to do is to comment both on the good and the issues that it in turn raises from the point of view of whether it may have overshot in some respects, whether some of it may or may not be complete or achievable, etc. So I will be putting these questions to our colleagues on the panel. Again, I can't begin to say what a distinguished group this is. You all know. And rather than going through everybody's biographies, I will leave you to consult the material that you have and just get right on to it. I am going to start, if I may, with Dr. Gil, and ask you, if you would, to give us your thoughts as to whether this is indeed as significant an event as many of us have and many commentators have said that it is, from the point of view of triggering competition, from the point of view of triggering potentially new investment. Does it really usher a new era in the sector?
Well, you have already made a pretty good presentation, and I simply agree with it. That's exactly what it will do.
And does it actually have all the components? Does it have the elements that you would have been hoping to see in it?
It certainly does. For instance, it goes even at the constitutional level in great detail to establish a set of conditions. It requires IFETEL, the new institute, to establish asymmetric conditions, something that has been subject of a lot of controversy in the courts. The reform states categorically that IFETEL has to establish asymmetric conditions. Asymmetric conditions means treating unequals differently. Firms in Mexico have been treated by COFETEL as if they were all the same size. The problem we have had with COFETEL is not so much not solely the injunctions or the stays, but also that COFETEL has not really assumed the role it should have. In this case, there is a mandate. IFETEL has to establish asymmetric conditions. It has to measure costs and has to treat differently the preponderant firm. It's no longer called the dominant firm, but for all practical purposes, it's the same. And also establishes a simple rule, which is already in the Constitution as well, to determine who is predominant. It says that it is sufficient to have 50% of the market. This is something that a lot of economists, experts on competition theory, have criticized from a purist point of view, saying that in order to determine who has preponderant power, you have to make a profound analysis. Well, this analysis has been going on at least for the past, let's say, 16, 17 years. When I was in Avantel, it turned out that the challenges we made at the time to the dominant firms turned out to be unconstitutional because of the legislation at the time. Then the legislation was changed, and we didn't even get the Competition Commission to start a research, an investigation after the new legislation. It had to be us that initiated the process, and it took even a long time for the Competition Commission to come up with an incredible resolution saying that Telmex is dominant where there is competition and not dominant where there is not. Really astounding. So it's really good news that the legislation also entrusts the new institute with the capacity to determine the competitive nature of a market. This is true only of telecommunications and media, not of other sectors of the economy, which have to be dealt with at the level of the Competition Commission, which is also being revamped, fortunately. Also, the constitutional reform takes into account the need to make sure that the 7 commissioners of each of the 2 commissions are subject to very tight and well-defined filters, so that they are not suspect of having been chosen because of political affiliations or affiliations with certain firms or individuals. 3 entities, the Institute of Education, newly created, which is autonomous, the Institute of Statistics and Geography, which is also autonomous, right, and the Central Bank, will have to examine and process the names of these individuals. I think the number has risen to about 4,000 now of candidates. So they're going to have a job in order to be able to come up with a crop.
And as I understand it, they will deliver to the president a choice of 5 per vacancy.
That's correct.
The president then chooses 1 to nominate.
That's
correct.
correct.
And it requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate.
It'll be the central bank, not the 3. This will be channeled through the central bank. The central bank will present the 5 for each position to the president. The president will choose from those 35 the 7 that are going to be submitted to the Senate, and the Senate in turn may or not approve the proposals of the president. But even if the Senate rejects an individual, there are 4 others there that may replace the person who was objected to. So I think the process has been very carefully crafted, and that the different elements, which are many, the constitutional reform is incredibly detailed. It's something that also scandalizes a few lawyers, because the Constitution supposedly is for general statements and should not contain so many specific conditions or elements. But as you well said, this was the only way to break a judicial barrier that has been there for so many years, and to break it in relation to this very important sector, which is telecommunications.
John, looking at it from the point of view of the markets, prospective investors in the sector, and based on the outline of what is in the reform already, would you think that it contains the elements needed to really attract and trigger new capital that would enter the sector? Would that be likely to happen only from internal sources or domestic sources, or would it be likely to happen actually with sources from abroad?
Sure. It's as you think about investment into the sector, right? You step back and you say, ultimately, someone wants to be able to make an economic profit on making that investment. And historically, there have been some barriers to particularly foreign investment in the country. The inability to have control of their investment has been a big focus. And I think, to answer your question, it will ultimately be how committed the regulators are to the changes and how they enforce it. I think you'll see more people. I mean, it's an attractive market. As you started at the beginning of your overview, the Mexican telecom market is underpenetrated, and there are a few places where people can put money in a more developed economy where they have the opportunity to put capital to work and see some opportunity for growth. And so I think you will see more people looking, more foreign investors looking at putting capital into Mexico. But ultimately, I think it's going to be their belief and the conviction of the regulators to continue to back competition and do some of the things that at a high level they've outlined to try and create a more level playing field for new entrants.
Right. So it remains to be seen how it is in fact executed upon.
Correct.
Gustavo, you're in the content world. Your discovery is in the media side. How do you perceive the reforms? Are they responsive to the needs that you would have identified before the reform was done?
Well, we look at it from a different perspective. Obviously, we're paid television. We've been in the market for almost 20 years. And Mexico is now our 5th largest international market. I think it would probably be even higher on that list if there weren't some of these barriers to entry, as John was saying, and some of the anti-competitive activity that we've seen in Mexico in the market over the last 20 years or so that we've been in the industry. So I think conceptually, the idea is great. The language that's used in the decreto is music to our ears. But does it go, one of the things that Mr. Hill was saying was that it goes into certain details that might get some lawyers upset. In our case, it doesn't go into enough details about issues that we've been facing as an industry. Cable TV penetration in Mexico has doubled in the last 5 years. As a result, I think we've been seen as a threat to a lot of the incumbents, mostly the broadcasters, and mostly in terms of advertising. I think a lot of the advertising dollars have shifted from broadcast to cable TV. And the incumbents have used their considerable power to try to influence changes in the way that rules that have been in effect for many years have been interpreted. For instance, the federal law of Mexico says that there should be a healthy equilibrium between advertising and programming on pay TV networks. And there's a regulation that says that 144 minutes per day is a healthy equilibrium. We've been interpreting that ever since we've been in business there as, not exceeding 144 hours a day and not exceeding 144 minutes a day. Exactly, that'd be a problem. Nobody would be watching. But, basically, not to exceed 12 minutes per hour as long as we don't go over the 144 minutes. So an average of 6 minutes per hour. A year and a half ago, several of the cable operators who are also have similar owners to the broadcasters started enforcing their own stricter interpretation that it was a 6-minute cap, not a 6-minute average, and started dropping networks from their systems that were exceeding 6 minutes of advertising per hour. We went to the RTC and asked for a written formal confirmation that our practice that had been going on since we've been there was fine. Yeah, that practice
the
of
RTC being
the regulator of our industry until
Correct.
Maybe now. Who knows at this point with the new regulation?
It would appear that its functions will shift over.
Will shift over. So that's one of the issues. So the RTC confirmed in writing to us, no, your practice is fine. You could air up to 12 minutes an hour as long as you don't exceed the 144 minutes per day. 2 months later, they issued a reversal saying, no, actually, it's really 6 minutes capped per hour. We're sorry. This became an issue for us. We feel there's no restrictions on the broadcaster, so we think this is even an NAFTA concern, and that there is unequal treatment between the locally owned broadcasters and the mostly foreign American-owned pay TV networks. So we've been raising these issues. We were able to get an amparo against the RTC's second resolution. So right now we have a temporary injunction, which gives us, we're operating under the first the decree validating our earlier position. So we were hoping that in the regulation, in the reform, there would be some sort of mention. There is a mention of advertising minutes in there, but it just says that the IFETEL will have the authority to determine how many minutes or govern the advertising on television.
The proportion of advertising to programs.
So I think that our issue goes to the core of this, and I would expect and hope that now in the 180-day regulatory process that our issue will be addressed. But it's obviously not addressed in there. But it does raise the point. Now, what happens now with this new entity? Does this new reform make the old federal law obsolete? Where's the RTC's place? Where's Gobernacion's place in all of this, where the RTC reports to? Is the IFETEL now the authority? And if so, how much power do they have? I think this issue that we were saying, and it's very comforting to hear what Mr. Hill was saying, that there is a very strong vetting process and good filters. But what happens if at some point this agency, which is pretty omnipotent, that can determine what's anti-competitive, it takes over the role of the Competition Commission, also determines what a license are, and you can't get an injunction against any action that they take. What kind of safeguard do we have if they overextend themselves? So obviously there are some concerns. Conceptually, we like the idea of this reform. It's a long time coming. We need it in the market, but what does it really mean, and are our issues really going to be addressed?
Does the intention to license and launch 2 new networks with national coverage, does that not create an opportunity for content providers, content producers?
It absolutely does,
material.
and I think you're going to have several groups competing for those concessions, and that's it's gonna help to it's kind of been a two-party system in a sense of the broadcasters in Mexico for many years. So that's really going to change the dynamics a little bit and maybe change the power structure. And obviously, as a company that produces content, we're the #1 nonfiction media company in the world. Obviously, that's an exciting opportunity. But really, our business is pay TV. It's a great model. We like the dual revenue stream model of pay television, and Mexico we see as a market that still has a way to grow in terms of penetration. So cable TV is still a thriving business in Mexico, and we expect it to continue. So we support that business. That being said, we will obviously look at these opportunities of getting involved, maybe with a partner in one of these broadcast channel opportunities.
Now, one thing that many observers have predicted is that one of the immediate consequences of the reform will be that the same people who are connected with, say, the preponderant players in one sector will now be freed, in effect, to become competitors in the other, and the other way back as well. So we may be seeing an entry from the larger players into each other's territory. Anyone would like to comment on that prospect? Is that likely? Are we likely to see that? And how would it impact the dynamic of the sector if that occurred?
Well, the legislation contemplates precisely that. To the extent that the preponderant firm accepts all the rules that are going to be established, it will be allowed to converge with all its services.
Exactly.
So that presumably may happen, and if it doesn't comply, the Constitution also contemplates the breaking up of the conglomerate. So we're talking about pretty stiff sanctions, which are in the Constitution itself. Therefore, the end result, I think, is very likely.
What is your perception, John, if I could ask you, of how this compares with other schemes in other countries that have made a particular push to open up what was previously a less than optimally competitive system?
Absolutely. Yeah, I look at sort of just the North American context. Clearly the U.S., it's a little bit dated now, but the U.S. Back in the 90s did some very aggressive things to break up the preponderant, dominant carrier there. And more recently in Canada, we've seen some actions that are very aligned actually with some of the things that are being proposed in Mexico in terms of getting rid of foreign ownership restrictions to try and bring in foreign capital. I think this goes farther, to be honest, than in either of these other countries, if again they actually execute on what they put forth. Full and open access to networks was something that was proposed in both the U.S. and Canadian context, and the incumbents were able to sort of limit the way that actually occurred. And what we saw, particularly in the U.S., was a massive influx of capital to try and fund new entrants into the marketplace that would be able to provide telecom services on the back of the incumbents' network assets. And I think the outcome of that was it was very hard to do that in an effective and profitable way. And so what we saw was over time that those new entrants, migrated from using the assets of the incumbent to actually investing in building their own competitive assets in the marketplace. So I think we'll see. Do you want to comment? Okay, sorry.
I'm going to wait until you finish. I'm sorry.
No worries.
I didn't want to interrupt.
No worries. So I think we'll have to see in the Mexican marketplace just how far and how open the regulators will make the preponderant carriers give others access to their network. I think there's some other things on the wireless side in particular. I think we know of in my daily doings as an investment banker. We talked to many global carriers about the Mexican market and the opportunities that reside there. There's obviously a large Latino population in the U.S. that the U.S. carriers have as customers. There's a lot of traffic that goes between the U.S. and Mexico. I think there's an interest in finding a way to participate in the Mexican market. They've obviously done that in the past. But to be able to do that without owning your own network assets becomes fairly challenging unless, again, the regulators are pushing to the farthest ends of the spectrum in terms of what they will be able to, what they will make the incumbents allow new entrants to do in the marketplace. So, anyway.
Well, in this regard, the fact that we had more than 2/3 of Congress approving these reforms, and that the Constitution also provides for the new IFETEL to inform Congress regularly on how they are working, means that Congress is going to be on top of them. So it's not only the executive, but also the legislative that is going to have a role in looking at the way they implement the reform. And I have talked to some of the key legislators after the constitutional reform, and usually it is me who tries to reach them and talk to them and see what they are thinking and try to convince them and so on. In this case, they have searched me, and what they want is to have the possibility of comments on the secondary legislation to be sure that it's going to be tough enough and it's going to be effective enough. So you see people in Congress from the different political shades really on top of the matter. So I'm pretty optimistic that this will happen.
What would you say then if you were looking 3 or 5 years ahead? Or you tell me what the right horizon is. what would then be the metrics that would tell you that there's been very substantial progress, that a significant corner has been turned?
Well, for instance, if we have access in competitive conditions to the network, comparing the rates that are charged by providers that are competitive vis-a-vis the preponderant firm. To give you an example, transportation of a minute costs between 18 and 22 minutes if done by an independent cable operator. The preponderant firm charges us 75 cents, and the cable operator makes a profit. So we're going to look at those prices, of course. We're going to look at the physical conditions. Right now, the type of construction that we have to make in order to interconnect is different from what is accustomed in the rest of the world. We are forced to use transportation, even though we are at the same spot connecting with other firms. We have to use them for transportation, although all the fibers are at the same place. And for transporting maybe 1 centimeter, we are charged 75 cents a minute. So those types of things have to change really quickly.
That doesn't strike you as reasonable?
Well, it took me a long time to.
But what would that then? I was wondering more along the lines of what would the consumer see, or what would an external observer of the sector, that is, what would you expect would be the metrics or the targets in terms of penetration, cost, speed, quality of service, etc.?
Well, an international comparison, I think, is useful. Look at Central America. You have countries like El Salvador that have coverage of about 115, 120% of mobile users to population, and we have 80%.
Right.
So why not expect something like that for Mexico if competition really brings down prices and improves services and extends coverage, which it will. Also, a greater penetration of the backbone, of the fiber optic backbone, is something to be expected. And higher speeds, competition is going to bring higher speeds at lower costs, for sure. We have a floor, and the floor is precisely the charges that we have to face from the backbone owner. Imagine that you had somebody who owned all the highways, and all the highways were toll highways. If you had competition in trucking and buses, you would still have monopoly prices for the customer. And that's what we have. The highway for zeros and ones is monopoly owned, and it charges monopoly prices. So to the extent that monopoly is forced to charge competitive prices and accept competitive conditions, then the prices for customers are also going to fall.
And how much of a stake do you put, or how much faith do you have in the notion that there will be this alternative backbone put into place over the course of the next several years?
I'm pretty confident. Look at a firm that, like ours, has already invested, without those conditions, $13+ billion in Mexico. And that means
you were one of the bidders for the dark fiber that CFE put up for auction.
And there is going to be considerable more dark fiber available in the future. So I'm pretty confident that's going to happen.
In terms of spectrum policy, what should we be looking at? What would be important determinants of progress in terms of how spectrum policy is being applied, in terms of what's being put up for auction or what's being put up for licensing, which of the frequencies are being made available and on what basis, etc.?
Well, it depends very much on the type of handsets that are going to be more popular and the type of frequencies that manufacturers are going to use. It is said that in the US, for instance, 1700 is going to be the one that handset manufacturers are going to favor. If that is so, then we should expect bidding for the 1700 spectrum in Mexico, which is pretty empty right now. So I don't see a ceiling or a problem there, a supply issue.
And John, I'm curious from your point of view in terms, you made a point about integration of the markets, or the possibility of integration of the markets, the fact that there are companies in the US that service a population. What will that translate into in your view? And that is, concretely, what will it translate into? What sorts of transactions would it lead to?
Well, it's hard to speculate, but there's clearly the U.S. market has started to see a pretty meaningful slowdown in growth on the wireless side. We've sort of hit terminal penetration at this point. It's really more about share shifting and extracting more from the existing subscriber base than actually growing the subscriber base. I think to some degree, there's some growth in number of devices on the network as people have multiple devices, tablets, et cetera. And so, you've seen even in the press, players like AT&T being very vocal about looking globally for growth. We've seen some press recently about Vodafone and Verizon potentially figuring out their ownership situation in a context which Verizon may own 100% of Verizon Wireless and free themselves up to look more globally. So I think that the ability to now actually own and control an operation in Mexico, that becomes much more attractive. I guess the real question is, and around spectrum, is the goal of the regulators to improve the competitive position for players like Telefonica that are in the marketplace, or to incent new players to come in and start greenfield? Because the reality, I think, is, as we've seen in many markets, greenfield is very difficult. It would take someone on the scale of a large-scale global player like an AT&T or Verizon to make that investment and make that bet. Whereas there are things that the regulators can do in terms of the way they allocate spectrum and auction spectrum and other tariff maneuvers to make it make it easier for existing players to compete more effectively with the predominant player.
Does the fact that the government is undertaking to build this shared network that would effectively offer on a wholesale basis the access to specific pieces, wouldn't that be a likely incentive or encouragement?
Absolutely, and I would say, others comment, I would say access to incremental spectrum as well.
Right.
That's we found in the wireless sector, right? You need access to as much spectrum as you can get, and you need cheap backhaul, which is the shared network would likely provide. So.
Gustavo, is convergence? Where does that ultimately take you, or take a firm like yours?
Well, obviously, competition is great in any market, and as Mr. Hill was saying, it results in better prices for consumers and better options and better technology, and so I think ultimately the consumers always win, and for us, it's a matter of most of these companies that are involved are partners of ours that have been our partners for many years. And the way we look at it as content producers is that we always try to make sure that we reach our viewers in the way they want to be reached, and as many viewers as possible. So anything that it will increase the penetration in the market, ease for the viewers to get to our content, and more affinity of our product is great. So I think all of these things are very positive for us. If there's a demand for more content, we're a content producer. If there's more people accessing content and more availability to different parts of segments of society that didn't have access to it before, that's great for us. So we see this all as a positive development.
Let me, before I open it to questions, ask an awkward question of the panel. What could go wrong? Where are the pitfalls that are out there that one would be alert to? Are there holes in the contemplated regulatory framework, or are there market dynamics that may escape the goals even of the legislator or of whoever, or the regulator?
I think it's early to say. We have to look at the members of the Institute to see how the secondary legislation comes out. And we'll soon be able to answer that. It's going to be only a few months. But I think
they're supposed to do a lot of work in 6 months.
They better.
I think that's right. I think in the next 180 days are going to be crucial to this process, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people knocking on doors to get their issues heard. But I think now's the time. The devil's always in the details, right? So, and now's the time to create those details. So, I think we're really going to see now whether it's going to happen. And the other concern was the one I raised earlier, is just the concentration of power in one entity, this super entity regulator, which that always scares me. And again, it goes back to the issue, the concern of, let's see who the people are who are appointed to this commission, and see how they take to their task and with what seriousness they go to follow the mandate of this reform, which is very clear, to level the playing field, and hopefully they'll take it seriously, and it'll work. I mean, obviously we're all optimistic, I think, and we want the best for the market.
You don't need to say. I appreciate it. No one wants to cast a pall over it necessarily. May I invite questions from the audience, please? I think we have microphones, and if you would please use the microphone and identify yourself, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Good afternoon. Jorge Campos. Just in terms of the timing, what gave way to allowing for this structural reform to occur? I mean, in the past, multiple parties have also advocated for similar structural changes. What is it about the timing that allowed for this to happen?
I think you're the best position to answer.
To defer on that.
I don't remember the exact number of weeks, but it's weeks. There is a mandate in the Constitution for the members of IFETEL to be named. There is a mandate for them to act, to issue the rules that they have to issue, and that will take place before the end of the year.
But I think your question was directed at how did this all come about? What was the confluence of circumstances that enabled it to happen? Did I understand your question?
Well, I think that the new administration for the first time is convinced that we need competition in the market in different conditions and rules. I'll give you an example of the time I was in Avantel, at the time of the Ernesto Zedillo government. The most appetizing market for a long-distance operator like us at the time even now, was the international long-distance market. The settlement of payments for calls always favors the country that receives more calls. And Mexico, I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the billions of dollars, maybe $3 or $4 billion per year. Well, the government decided once Alestra and Avantel entered for the first time to compete in the long-distance market with Telmex, that we would not be able to get more of that market than our share of the internal market in order to prevent competition. So that gives you an idea of the stance of the way that different governments have looked at telecommunications. Governments have until now been captured by the predominant firm, up until now, not anymore.
I think it's hard to overstate how notable it is that at the very beginning of this administration, literally on the second day of the administration, so obviously this was a process that had been going on during the transition. A series of commitments were made in the form of what has come to be known as the Pacto, or Pacto por México, that really addressed a long-standing list of requirements, and the parties were able to somehow come together and agree on a very detailed agenda that they then committed to support. Actually, simply a remarkable event from the point of view of developing a consensus that actually predated the start of the administration and has now been executed upon. I guess the most that one could say, or having been on the outside of it, is there was some very, very skillful political negotiation being done. I believe you had a question.
I just wanted to make a comment to the discussion.
Please.
To contribute. There's also been at the same time a liberalization of the petrochemical industry in Mexico. And I think there's a general, the same Pacto por México, there's been a general recognition that competition is the only way for Mexico to grow as a country. And that it's restrictive and monopolistic regime has held it back for so many years. My question was going to be, what about... What about the streaming media industry? Do you see what do you see as a future for that, considering the liberalization of the telecommunications industry? And lastly, under the rubric of bugaboos or what could go wrong, corruption. Do you see any opportunities for that pernicious practice to enter these markets?
I don't know that was directed to anyone in particular, but on streaming media, let's hear on that first.
Sure, I think the streaming always depends on the quality of the broadband, and so I think as that improves, obviously streaming will improve. It's all about a question of quality and how long it takes to stream the videos. But I think that's definitely with an increased spectrum and a bigger, larger broadband, that's inevitable that's gonna grow.
And of course the objective, the stated objective, is to achieve dramatically greater penetration of broadband and coverage, availability. Interestingly, though, if you look at the likely capital expenditures needed to extend broadband availability, say to something like 70% of the population of the country, and then try to compare that with what it will take to reach a substantially larger, say nearly universal coverage, say 98 or 97% or something. The capex, as I understand it, quadruple. So no doubt there will be a point at which it sort of plateaus, and the actual access is deferred, meaningfully for some potentially pretty large group.
Well, there's always new technology.
There's always new technology. Exactly right.
Well, and that's no different than other countries in the world where, getting to that last few percentage is economically not viable. So, including
Right.
here, and it's probably actually lower than here. Probably more here than it is in Mexico. So.
I don't know if the question about corruption has to do with telecom or is it a general question?
Well, telecom and media. I mean, these have been, there are entrenched interests that may try to use pernicious ways to maintain their control.
I think that's where the thrust of the reform is precisely to be sure that the new elements of this commission are sufficiently divorced from special interests. They are going to earn a pretty good salary, which is an important ingredient. According to the reform, they have to earn the same salary as a member of the Supreme Court. So that's why you have 4,000 fellows applying for the job. Partly.
Let's take that question back there, please.
Hi, Ariane Ortiz from Moody's. My question is, do we expect any meaningful impact in investment as a percentage of GDP and GDP growth out of this reform, or should it not be the case? And in that, how long as well?
Let me just say one interesting number that pops out in that regard. The COFETEL's own evaluation, from what I understand, is that, and I don't exactly know the source of this, is that for every 10 points of additional broadband penetration, you are in all likelihood adding as much as 1.4% growth to GDP. That is to say that what that facilitates, the activity, the connectivity, the speed, communication that brings with it, actually has that material an impact if you go from, say, 17 to 27% penetration broadband. Those are just numbers. One doesn't know for sure that it would convert into that in reality. But that certainly is the expectation and the assumption, and that's what drives all this. You were going to comment on it.
Well, I couldn't say it better than you did. I agree completely.
Okay. Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Jorge Baxter. I'm from Sesame Workshop. Two questions. One, does the legislation have anything in it that regards public broadcasting? Does it change that landscape? And the second piece of this is a broader question about, and it may be early, what intellectuals, what others are saying about the impact of this reform potentially on politics in Mexico, politics and culture. In particular, strengthening the debates, civic culture, all that kind of stuff.
Let me answer quickly the first part of your question, and that is that we haven't focused here on many other social, political aspects of the reform. And by the way, there is a whole reform of the competition process outside of telecom that's also built into this. But in fact, if you read through the reform, it starts out with a number of very affirmative provisions about the right to information, about the right to free expression, and about the importance of having broader coverage in terms of the availability of content. And there is a specific provision for the creation of a public broadcasting system, which Mexico has not had. I'll invite our panelists to speak about the other question that you raised.
Well, everybody has Twitter and Facebook now, so the participation is already pretty wide.
Any other thoughts on how this is going to all affect politics or the social fabric of the country?
Well, you know, like you said, I think there's a lot of language in there. They want to. It's almost like a net neutrality language that you could read into that law that says that everyone should have a voice, and part of the mandate of this commission is to make sure that there's a plurality of opinions and voices out there, and that part of it is to promote even Mexican culture and the national identity through media. I mean, all that language is written into the rules. So again, the devil's in the details. What does that mean? You know, this whole thing contains a lot of beautiful language, but what does it mean in reality? And I think over the next 6 month implementation period, we'll see how that plays out into actual regulations. Right?
You know, it's interesting. There's a provision that has at least in my view, a somewhat unusual language. It says. Se prohíbe la transmisión de publicidad o propaganda presentada como información periodística. You're prohibited from transmitting or broadcasting publicity or propaganda disguised as news information or journalism. And I am, and it goes on to say that the conditions will be established that will govern the content and the contracting of services for the transmission of information to the public. And I must say, I find that rather a broad statement, and, you know, again, it's been elevated to constitutional rank, and I don't know quite how that will translate into the regulation of speech in any form. Please.
Did any of you actually read the whole OECD report?
Yes.
That's a no? Did you? So here's what I found interesting about it and surprising. They didn't seem to take any issue with wireless pricing in Mexico. It was landline pricing that they were quite upset about. That surprise you? They actually said wireless pricing was pretty competitive to the rest of the OECD countries, and that the landline pricing was the big problem. Why does anybody care about landlines anymore?
Well, they are right. I wish it was less competitive than it is.
I couldn't hear you.
I wish it was less competitive than it is. My prices are pretty low.
Or yours are lower than Telmex, right?
That's the only way we can compete.
So why isn't your market share bigger? That's what I've always wondered, if you have lower prices.
Well, let me give you a few examples of what happens if a customer tries to switch from Telcel to us. First of all, they have to ask for an identification number according to the portability rules. Once they do that, Telcel disconnects them, except for calls to its call center. So after a few hours, the customer becomes desperate because it cannot use the phone, and will phone back Telcel and say, I'll stay with you. I haven't been able to make a call for a few hours, so I'll stay with you. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is, and this is going to change because the Constitution eliminates exclusivities. They have exclusivities in many distribution points. For instance, if Carso owns a department store or a mall, we're not able to put a distribution point there.
And they own many.
And they own many.
Yeah.
So I could go on and on, but you see the presence of Carso makes for a lot of different exclusivities. And there is another element. If you go to a firm, we have been very successful with individuals, with families and individual persons. But if you go to a firm, in many cases, they will say, you're getting this price and this service with a fixed line, and you're getting this service and this price with your internet. If you switch to Telefónica or to Usacell or Unifón or Nextel, you're not going to get the same treatment you have been getting. So they bundle. They may not bundle in the sense of putting a price on all the services, but they bundle the conditionality. And that makes it very hard also to enter in the market in a greater percentage. So there is a monopoly in many senses, not only in the telecom senses, that you have to deal with.
What about the pricing, though? I mean, you said you like less competition when it comes to wireless, right?
Oh, I would love to be the monopoly.
Please.
Hi, my name is Javier Alvarado. It was not long ago that I remember hearing the news in Mexico that two adversaries were joining forces when Slim tried to go into television. He started broadcasting, using the internet to broadcast, and two previous TV broadcasters joined forces, Televisa and TV Azteca, to block the entrance or the Slim's attempt to go into television, and now they're partnered up and they're teamed up for wireless. And my concern, or maybe my question, is that whenever you see a business path from an industry that gets consolidated, then the next step from consolidation is collusion, right? And does the existing law or the reform has a governing body, or has to be able to spot sometimes when big consolidated players just collude because maybe next time they want to block the entrance of AT&T or some other big player around there? So is there any kind of system that identifies? Thank you.
Well, I think much is being invested in the ability and effectiveness of this particular new institution that's being created. And of course, there are those who have some skepticism about whether it will have quite the ability from day one to jump in and really control and avoid these collusive or monopolistic practices or anti-competitive practices. There is potentially some downside to not having within the IFETEL the same level of experience and history that was already at COFECO, at the Competition Commission. Taking jurisdiction away from the COFECO and giving it to the IFETEL in telecommunications could conceivably result in some disconnect from that point of view. And that point of view has been articulated. It was obviously overwritten for purposes of the reform. Please.
I would like to add that what you mentioned before about must offer, must carry, that's already in the Constitution. So they must offer their programming at no charge. And that particular issue was handled by the Competition Commission, and the resolution of the Competition Commission was that they could charge. So that is an instance of the new outlook regarding competition that you can see is quite different from what used to be. I remember a TV interview I had a few weeks ago in which the lady that was interviewing me asked me about the precisely change in the powers of competition from the Competition Commission to the Telecom Commission. And I told her, well, we have had 13 instances in which we have gone to the Competition Commission to obtain a resolution, only 13. And in those 13, and she was nice enough to allow me to enumerate each one and to explain each one, in those 13 occasions, the resolution from the Competition Commission was in favor of Telmex and against us. So I'm very happy that all that knowledge from the Competition Commission is going to be lost.
So when Telefónica begins to exercise monopoly powers, we will see them come after them.
Oh, I will be so happy.
All right.
Hi, I'm Laura Torre. You did mention that bigger companies would have a strategic advantage in entering the market, perhaps due to the need for infrastructure. Do you think that smaller companies might also have a different strategic advantage, since there are must offer and must share provisions in the new law?
Yeah, it all depends on, it remains to be seen. I think if you read it, I think possibly yes. But it all depends on how the incumbents, somebody else mentioned, how are the incumbents going to take advantage or find a way to maintain their power? Because obviously, this is an assault on something that's been around for a long time. So I don't think it's going to be easy, but it all depends on how this whole thing is regulated, implemented, and how it's put into practice. But I think ideally that's the intent. But there's some strong, powerful incumbents that are still going to probably be using all of their power, all of their considerable power to prevent new players from entering. Right?
Or if not incumbents, new incumbents.
Right, or new incumbents.
That is,
right.
large organizations that are able to collect the wherewithal to become the next 600 pound.
Yeah,
That's right. Anything else? Any other questions? I'm sorry, was there one or no? Okay, well, Randy, I think we're going to wrap up then, if that's okay. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you so much to our panelists for an exceptional discussion. Thank you.